So good morning, everyone, and welcome to our latest talk. We're just going to sort of talk slowly while the people filter in. And you'll note we're recording this, so you should be getting a pop-up just to okay that recording it as in this format. You're as an attendee, you're not recorded in any case, but it is just to make you aware. For those of you who've been here before, you know the Simon Talks is something we do on a monthly basis. And sort of our reasoning or thinking behind them is we develop a lot of policy positions. We spend a lot of our time thinking about the solutions to homelessness, and we borrow from an enormous body of work that is produced by colleagues, academics, and think tanks, you know, around the world and in Ireland. We use that to inform our positions and then sort of present that in terms of looking at the solutions to homelessness, I suppose, with a Simon Communities of Ireland perspective. We think there's a real value in providing a platform to our colleagues who do all the work of you know, sort of invest in that research to ensure that it gets to a wider audience, but also that people understand a bit more about where we're coming from as well. Because if you understand the basis of what we're basing some of our policy positions on, you can see how we get there and perhaps see the greater logic. That's really what the Simon Talks are all about. We're delighted today to have Clotilde Clark-Foulquier, almost, I'm going to names of that, who is project manager in FEANTSA, which is the European Federation of National Associations working with the homeless, of which the Simon Communities of Ireland are an active member. She is coordinating the Housing Solutions platform and leading FEANTSA's work on energy poverty, working for a fair balancing of climate and social objectives. I'm going to hand over to Clotilde to talk about the report which they have produced on vacancy. I would say, as she kind of does the presentation, if a question pops into your head, we have a chat box and a Q&A box down below, and you can just, if you want to put the question in there, even as you think of it. So we'll store it up. We will come to the questions once Clotilde has finished her presentation, and I'll put them to her as we go along. And finally, if you are on any of the various modes of social media, obviously please do tweet and text and WhatsApp or whatever it is you do about the talk, and if you can use the hashtag Simon Talks, we can see it as well and retweet your comments and be part of the conversation on these important topics. Okay, so with that, I'm going to hand over to Clotilde to give us her presentation. Thank you, Clotilde.
Thank you, Wayne. Good morning. I will share my presentation to start with. First, thank you very much for inviting FEANTSA to present the results of our report. Can you see my slide?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, great. So, as you mentioned, I coordinate the Housing Solutions platform for FEANTSA. Housing Solutions platform is a partnership between FEANTSA and other organizations, namely the Fondation Abbé Pierre in France, Housing Europe, which is a network for social and cooperative housing, and Habitat for Humanity, because we decided together that to find a solution to homelessness, housing is a key. And we need to better identify what are the housing solutions existing at local level, even very small scale one, so that we can debate those solutions, possibly replicate them. And we have a network of experts across Europe, cross-sectoral experts, going from academia to industry, architects, and others, trying to identify what are the housing solutions that work. And so starting from there, we had the idea last year to try to better work with cities, to better understand their housing needs, how they address homelessness, what were the bottlenecks and what were the potential solutions. So we conducted interviews with some specific cities we had contact with. We did some desk research. and issued a report in December 2022 on urban challenges, housing solutions, and basically how to better understand vacant housing in Europe and how are cities addressing vacant housing. So I will start by first giving you a brief overview of what's happening at European level, and then presenting some of the cities' action from the report. Okay, so first, the European political context. Well, I'm sure you know we have a housing crisis, and you can see on the right the statistics by Eurostat. So it's very wide because it's European wide, and it's over 2010 to 2021. But what we can see is that there is a rent increase in Europe and a house price increase of about 30% average. So this hides, of course, big disparities between rural areas and the European megalopoles, where house prices have really gone skyrocketing high. So there is a lack of affordable housing, particularly in many cities in Europe, and an increase in housing prices. And at FEANTSA, we can testify of an increase in homelessness across Europe in almost all European member states over the past 10 years. What does it mean politically? Is that we can see the emergence of a European housing agenda. So there is no European housing competency, but we see little by little a housing political agenda at European level. This can be seen, for instance, on political initiatives relating to Roma inclusion, to macroeconomic governance, and many others. And the one that is very important because it's binding and it will change everything is the Green Deal that was launched in 2020 by the European Commission. And basically it is a new growth strategy for the European Union. The idea is really to be climate neutral in terms of emission, and it will touch on everything: food, transport, research, and of course, the building of environments. And it's interesting for us because as part of the Green Deal, the European Commission has launched the renovation wave for Europe. So with a massive ambition to renovate the housing stock in Europe, of course, including vacant housing. As part of the renovation wave, European institutions are working now on the EPBD, so Energy Performance of Building Directive, among other things that is looking to introduce mandatory energy performance standard for the residential sector, and not only for newly built buildings, as it was the case before, but really for the residential sector for everyone by 2030. So that's something big that is to be voted in the European Parliament next month. Still, as part of this European agenda, the European Commission has launched what we call the NEB, so it's a new European BAOS, and this is not binding. It is just to introduce some coherence in this renovation way, to introduce values that should guide the renovation. So the three core values of this new European BAOS movement is that the renovation wave is to be sustainable, beautiful, and inclusive. And this should guide many of the programs at local and national level in terms of renovating the building environment. And last one that I want to mention, but not least, is the EPOC, so the European Platform on Combating Homelessness that was introduced in 2021. So again, it's not binding, but it's a move of the European institution to facilitate mutual learning with the member state and data collection on homelessness. Where are we at on homelessness? How can we work better together to address homelessness at European level? So in terms of statistical knowledge of vacancy in Europe, it is difficult. First, because there is a lack of data available, but also because there is no harmonized definition of what vacancy is. Of course, there is also the difference, between natural and structural or problematic vacancy. But what we do know is that the OECD released a report last year looking at vacancies, and they identify countries with the most vacant building as Malta, Hungary, Cyprus, and also Poland. I will show you on the next slide. You can see better where Ireland relates in relation to other European countries. So it's complicated as well because what vacant housing is very complex. It's commercial vacancy, it's residential vacancy, it's primary residence or secondary residence, it's private investor keeping some housing just for speculative reason. And it's of course a mismatch between supply and demand that we can see in Europe very often. The major vacancy difficulty is in rural areas where employment is not. So for instance, Hungary has a 12% vacancy rate, but that is characterized by rural flight, basically, and the economic opportunities are not where the housing is. So that's the same data, but you can better see where Ireland is. So Ireland has quite a high vacancy rate for in comparison to European average as well. So how are cities in Europe addressing this vacant housing situation? So we conducted interview with several cities, and the first one I spoke to was Odense in Denmark. And I was quite surprised because they said vacancy is not so much of a problem for us, but the real challenge for us is to better understand our private rental sector. I thought all cities knew very well what was the state of their rental housing sector, and it's not the case. So I told them about the Irish example of the residential tenancy board and other example of, for instance, registration to better understand what's happening. And I want to stop with you for a moment on the example of Strasbourg. So it's the Euro metropole of Strasbourg, which contains 33 municipalities, 500,000 inhabitants, and about 60% of those are tenants. So they knew it's in France, and they knew they had a problem with vacancies, weren't sure how to address it. So they worked with their national housing agencies to develop several instruments to mobilize the housing stock for affordable housing solution. What they did is a pilot with 2 of their municipalities and with the National Public Finances Administration data, listing vacant dwellings. So thanks to this National Tax Administration data, they received list of where the vacant dwellings were. First, they filtered that to get rid of, for instance, garages or public housing stocks, and as well dwellings that were vacant for less than 3 years. And when they had that, basically they contacted the owners to better understand both the causes of vacancy and secondly, the profile of owners. And in terms of causes, what they realized is that why were vacant dwellings vacant? First, it's because the owner had negative experience in renting the dwellings, or they had difficulties in managing their property, maybe because they were in a care home or they were fearful of administrative procedures, for instance. What came up from this survey as well is that most of the owners were actually small landlords, and many of them were elderly people. So by better understanding who were the owners, the municipality developed a model of social rental intermediation that I will mention later on. Another interesting example on how to better understand the stock was developed in France after this initiative, so at national level. And basically, some cities who were part of the pilot project could access a digital tool developed thanks to national data from tax and property database to identify vacant dwellings. And once they knew who were the owners, they could contact them to try to develop an action plan on how to address vacant housing. Similar examples, for instance, in Thessaloniki in Greece, they cross-checked vacancy by analyzing electricity disconnection, or in Wallonia, so that's in Belgium. A regional decree authorized municipalities to look at water and electricity consumption to see where vacant dwellings. So once municipalities better understand where are the vacancies, they target owners. How? Well, with carrots and sticks. So first, incentives, because it's not necessarily big private investors who want to make money. Often vacancies, as we have seen from the examples before, are small landlords who are a bit overwhelmed and don't know how to mobilize their housing. So one of the key incentive tools that is developing rapidly in Europe, it's what we call social rental intermediation. So Wayne said you do have that in Ireland as well, and it's mainly managed by local authorities. So in other parts of Europe, it's not necessarily local authorities. It can be an NGO or a real estate agency with a social mission that will manage the renovations, for instance, guarantee the rents in exchange for the owners to agree to rent at a lower rate below market price. And this is an interesting example. I think it comes from Matao, so which is very close to Barcelona, because there it is the city that developed the rental intermediation, was first the mediator, guaranteeing owners that the rent would be paid, for instance. But what they did afterwards is that they developed a housing cooperative, and now they are trying to slowly disappear and leave the housing cooperative as the intermediary between owners and people who rent, so that the housing cooperative would be the one guaranteeing the rents and supporting owners, for instance, in the renovation process. Another example, so this is not cities, but I thought I should mention it because, so it's Italy €1 houses, because I'm sometimes told, oh, this doesn't exist, this is a joke, but it does exist, so I wanted to raise it up. So the situation is, and I believe it's the same in rural Spain and Portugal, and so in Italy, you have elderly people passing away with no relatives or relatives that don't want to live in the countryside. So the house slowly is damaged and abandoned. So the municipality or the local public authority has a responsibility of the dwelling. And they realized that by selling it at a very symbolic price, well, they get income in taxes, for instance. So the model is proposed by 25 Italian municipalities. They sell the house for just €1, but on the condition that the house will be renovated by the property owner within a given time frame, and it is often 3 years. Some municipalities ask the buyer to pay a guarantee fee so that to show that they have the financial capability to renovate. In terms of sanction, there is a wide variety of models for empty home tax. So I know in Ireland you have the vacancy tax that define vacant housing as a dwelling that has been left vacant for 30 days. But so the definition varies according to countries and cities. And for instance, in Leuven, Belgium, is considered vacant a dwelling that has no one registered in it on 1st of January. Still, the city of Leuven. So we had an interview with the city of Leuven housing lead, and he told us that the legislation has been hardened very recently in December 2022, and the vacancy property tax has been increased, so it has doubled for a room, and it has increased less, but it has increased as well for a whole home. Why a room? Because Leuven is a big student home, so there are many rooms rented to students. And this vacancy tax will now be indexed annually from 2024. Also interesting to know that it's the region who has the competency and who has given the city the right to temporarily withdraw housing units identified as vacant and to place them under the responsibility of social housing organization. So the result for 2022 were that 20 residential units were identified by the municipality. And after the process, one was rented through social rental agencies, so the model I described earlier. 5 were actually bought by the city through the right to first buy. And the other owners have taken action after being contacted by the municipality so as to renovate their dwellings and rent them, put them back on the rental market. Another example of legislation that has been modified recently to address more, I would say, aggressively vacant housing is Amsterdam. So, for instance, the definition of what is a vacant dwelling has changed. It used to be something that was left empty for 6 months, and now it's 2 months. And so the situation is in Amsterdam is that the owner have a responsibility to report vacant dwellings. And if they don't abide by this responsibility, they can be fined by the municipality. Once they have reported, the municipality get in touch with them to agree on an action plan, and the owner has 12 months to act, and if not, the city has a right to appoint a tenant. And there is in Amsterdam about 4,000 empty property, about 300 of them belonging to BlackRock. Barcelona is an interesting example as well, because it adopted in 2016 an ambitious right to housing plan with different instruments to address the housing crisis. In 2016, they developed a census to better understand the state of the vacant housing stock. And what is interesting to know there as well is that it is a regional competency. So the region of Catalonia authorized the municipality to take control as well of vacant property, of properties that have been left vacant for 2 years or more, so that the municipality can rent them at an affordable price. They have the ownership or the responsibility of the dwelling for 4 to 10 years. But what goes even further is that the municipality has the power to buy this apartment at 50% of the market rate. And in 2020, Barcelona contacted, I think, 14 companies to inform them that they were going to use this right if the dwellings were not put back to the rental market. One of my last points, yes, is how cities have, following on the COVID mainly, but not exclusively, how have they converted multi-unit commercial dwellings into residential units. So just if you're interested to know more about examples or how to do that, FEANTSA has developed this report, Upcycling Building. Sorry, we developed this with the Fondation Abbé Pierre and the Council of Europe Development Bank, who was looking to support the city of Prague in such a conversion of a hotel, but then in the end it didn't work out. But there is political interest to develop this kind of program. So that's the example of Berlin. So that wasn't following COVID because it was launched already back in 2013. But since then, it's been extended again and again. And last year, the mayor of Berlin declared Berlin must grow in width, density of height. So how does it happen? For instance, by giving authorization to add new housing units to existing housing units, to add housing units to small part or small pieces of vacant lands, for instance, and the conversion of vacant commercial unit into residential units. So how? Well, there is financial support given to owners and actually quite a strong backing from the federal government that is making billions available to support the construction and the renovation of housing. Yes. And that's my last example. And I know it's not a European one, but I think it's a very interesting one. It's Los Angeles. So during the COVID, the city of Los Angeles mobilized motels and hotels to house its homelessness population into emergency accommodation very quickly. And that was a room key project. But 2 years on, they decided they didn't want to put people back in the street. So they looked at how can we transform these hotels into long-term housing solutions. And it became the Home Key project. So how did they do that? First, they looked at what they called problem properties. So that's properties that had been flagged by building services as needed to be upgraded or in need of renovation. They also looked at the buildings that had the capacity to be very rapidly converted. They tried to identify properties that were close to social services, health services, but they also tried to acquire properties scattered across the cities so that they wouldn't destroy the social network of the homeless people that they would host in those buildings. And the conclusion is that they acquired 20 properties, so 16 motels, multi-family buildings, and a nursing home, and converted those very quickly, very efficiently. The key success, I think, in this project came from the political backing from the governor, for instance, who gave, I don't think it's possible in Europe to do that, but they gave the project pre-approval for all kind of authorization, so be it environmental permit or other kind of permit. Well, they received everything before even the project starting. So that was, yes, this Los Angeles project. And what I wanted to say is that there is room for more creativity. For instance, last year, I think John Lewis in the UK announced that they want to convert their car park into homes. And they have the ambition to build about 10,000 homes in their current car park. Another tool for mobilization of vacant housing or vacant dwelling, I think, is an interesting project of the Scottish Churches Action. So basically what they did there is that they set up an information office for churches in Scotland across denominations. So it was very wide, going from the Quakers to Catholic Church. And they developed an information office by the churches for the churches on how to renovate, but not only renovate, but also convert, maybe sell a piece of land to renovate the church hall and develop affordable housing on top of the church hall, or this kind of project. And it worked very well, but unfortunately the initiative stopped during COVID. Another bit out of the box idea, it comes from Italy. It's the mobilization of dwellings confiscated from the mafia and to use them for affordable housing solutions. And it's the same, I think, that is being developed now, dwellings confiscated from Russian oligarchs used for affordable housing development. In Berlin, there has been a referendum on is it possible to expropriate corporate landlords who are not putting their dwellings on the rental market. And the referendum took place and was voted, but was not legally binding, but the idea was passed. So as a conclusion, how can vacant dwelling be a potential rental supply? Well, the key is to better understand the stock at local level, then target owner with different kind of tools. There are many instruments, but further than that, I think the key is really for the national framework or regional local authorities to empower the cities to have the tool for action. And lastly is to build partnership, because as we have seen in many of these examples, it's about partnership with local authorities to have access, for instance, to the tax data, partnership with local NGOs to also provide services if necessary to former homeless people or people who have difficulties in paying their rents. So those are the few keys I would highlight. I think that's it for me, Wayne. I hope it was okay.
Thank you, Clotilde. Yeah, that was fantastic. A real comprehensive overview of a lot of what's happening around Europe. And I see our first note there. Just to use the chat or Q&A if we have any questions coming in from anyone who's watching. In the interim, I'll take advantage of my chairing position. I suppose you set out there in the last slide, kind of covering a lot of the sort of the infrastructure for how these things work, is a better understanding of the stock that's there, sort of getting out to and finding ways of communicating with the landowners, property owners, and how you target those. Empowering the cities, and then building partnerships to move the whole thing forward. I suppose of all the examples that you've looked at, which one, when we were talking earlier, you said really they have to be tailored to their to the locale, so that's really important. But I suppose two things. Which one stood out for you as being the best fit for its locale, i.e. which one was the most successful in terms of actually delivering rental accommodation? And I suppose the thing in the Irish context that's interesting to explore is the level of autonomy that our municipalities or local authorities have here. It is very limited, and the political oversight that's possible is limited. So can you talk a little bit more maybe about how empowering the cities and actually having that local knowledge and empowerment is really important? Because I think that's an interesting place for us to explore.
Okay. I'll start first with the examples. Okay. Well, I think the Los Angeles one, which is not in Europe, I know, but I was very struck by the efficiency. I think they developed the program in 4 months. Identifying the building, buying them, starting to convert them. It's a project over 2 years, but I I think it was quite amazing. Also, this idea, I don't know if it should be so much replicated and if it is replicable in Europe, but this idea to give authorization before the project so that it could be developed very quickly, because one of my questions to the project manager is, how did you overcome the not in my backyard movement? And basically they got all the authorization before the project started, so they just could go ahead and do it. And it was really the political willingness and the financial backing. They got what they needed to deliver a project, and it was done. And that was very impressive. And in Europe, I think I quite like the Strasbourg example, because they really started, well, we're going to look at the data, and it kind of linked to your second question, because they couldn't have done it alone. So they did it with the National Tax Authority, which enabled them to look at where the vacant dwellings. So we start from there, then we filter. One of the filtering criterions is, I think, what belonged to banks, for instance, they didn't target, which that can be contested. But okay, they filtered according to their criterions, then contacted the owner to better understand the grassroots. What are the difficulties, get a better picture from what the reality is, and then can respond to it. And I thought it was very simple but very interesting. And so on your question on local need, that's a pattern that came back throughout the report. Basically, cities that could act, they had been empowered by their regional or national authorities. They couldn't have done it alone. Be it access to data from electricity or water company, or from the tax authority. So this French digital tool I mentioned. In Austria as well, I didn't mention it in the PowerPoint, but it's in the report. The regional authority empowered 2 cities. I think one of them is Salzburg, to have access to data to better understand what is the situation and therefore act on it. I mean, it's as similar to the issue of homelessness. You can't do anything if you don't start with data. And this data, you need cooperation with regional and national authority to have access to it.
Okay, thank you for those. We actually have more questions coming in here. Interestingly, they're all based on the Irish experience, but they have a very similar theme. 3 questions here. So there's one question which is from Senator Mary Fitzpatrick. She's asking if we can circulate the slides. So we'll ask you about that, but that's usually what. And if you've no objection, we'll circulate them to all the people who came today as part of the process. I think there's a stream of questions, 3 questions here. One is about the stricter measures around vacant properties, such as those in Amsterdam. Would those work in Ireland? I think what the theme is that property rights here are very strong. We have a constitutional protection for private property, and both that, but there's also a culture of kind of the family home, the home, and the right to property being certainly a feeling that is very strong. Although my personal opinion is that might be overstated, but certainly there's evidence of it. So that was the other thing. In relation to the one, there was the question here from Noel about whether there's been a lot of legal challenges to the initiative, or any legal challenges to the initiatives you've identified. So was that kind of the right to property, or the property rights in the individual countries, were they seen as a barrier, and how were they got past if they were? And then there was one here who said, do we need to address the constitutional situation around the right to property here to target vacancy? And there's an example of houses in Dublin 6 who've been vacant for 16 years because the owners just don't seem to have any interest in them. And interestingly, it's all the residents feel it's criminal in the current crisis. And also, I mean, we know that vacancy is a blight on our, that is you have a less vibrant community if you have vacancy in it. So I think really, I suppose for you, the question is, in terms of the ones that you looked at, what was the legal framework around it, and were there many challenges that you're aware of? And I suppose that to answer the Irish question, I would imagine that there would be legal challenges if some of those initiatives that you've outlined there were to happen in Ireland. And I think we would have to perhaps look at the constitutionality of it. Interestingly, in the Irish context, we don't even look at those initiatives, because when the constitution is raised, it's used as a chill factor to say we can't even discuss these because they'd be against the constitution. So actually the merits of those kind of policies are stalled because of the weight of the expectation that the constitution would be against it. So I think certainly for some of the more the idea that a local authority would go in and just take charge of the property for 5 years because it was vacant for a period of time, I would have thought there would be, that the AGs would raise constitutional issues around that if it wasn't to be treated as emergency powers. So it possibly is something we need to look at in terms of balancing that rights of communities. So I've sort of in a roundabout way, hopefully for Kitty there, hopefully I've answered your question. If not, I'll come back to you, but I want to go back to Clotilde, just in terms of if you're aware of any of the legal barriers that had to be gotten over for the initiatives that you've talked about around the country, around Europe.
Okay. The short answer is no, I'm not aware of legal challenges. It might be, because the cities I spoke to didn't raise it. But I think there are two keys. First is that many of these initiatives started during COVID. So somehow it was an opportunity. All countries had emergency legislation. So that was an political opportunity. And secondly, I think what's happening today has been prepared by some policy changes and advocacy beforehand. So for instance, for the situation of Barcelona, now there is this right to buy, or that is available for vacant dwellings that has been vacant for 2 years. And I know they are trying to advocate the regional authorities so that this would apply for dwellings that have been vacant for 6 months rather than 2 years. So there is also a political battle, and then a political framework that is being changed. And then the municipalities act once this is doable. So that might be why there is no legal challenge. However, I do wonder, I don't know if she's here, but I saw she's one of the participants, a contact from Barcelona, because I would like to know more. They contacted, I think I mentioned it in the presentation, Barcelona contacted 14 companies that owned hundreds of dwellings in Barcelona to threaten that they would use their right to buy. And I wonder if there has been a legal challenge. I don't know.
Okay. Thank you. But it is interesting that they, by dealing with it in advance, in a lot of cases, they got past it. So they sort of laid the groundwork, which I think is very interesting. We've another question here, noting that Italy has a very good register of ownership and it's easy and free to search. In Ireland, we don't have the same level of land registry, and there's some work going on in that. But I think you mentioned it already about the available data and some of the collaborations that happened in different countries around becoming aware of where the vacant properties and vacant units are. So I suppose how important is a good open access like they had in Italy to design a vacancy initiative? So was that a common theme around the sort of the good examples that you found?
Well, access to data was a common theme, but then there were different entry points to access this data. So as I mentioned, electricity company, water company, tax office. I know some cities, and I think it's an Irish example as well, I've developed digital tools for the local community to be able to flag up what they so as a vacant dwelling. So definitely knowledge is a key, but then it depends how you do it.
Okay. So while we all might aspire to the Italian register of ownership, which is very easily searchable and transparent, ultimately it becomes about using the tools that are available to you to build up the best stock of knowledge you can, and then attacking the issue in that way. I think that's really interesting and probably a useful insight in the Irish context. I do think one of the issues that has come up in the Irish context for these things is where you're drawing the sort of slight distinction between vacancy and dereliction. When you get into a sort of a derelict property, you find that it's legally quite complex to unpack where the actual ownership is, particularly if it's been lying vacant or unused for many, many years. The thread of actually finding out who owns it becomes quite complex. Okay. So just see if, sorry, there's more. Another comment here. Interestingly, Finland has one of the highest rates of vacancy, higher than Ireland, but they have been able to reduce homelessness where it has increased in Ireland. Now, it would be interesting to understand what is going on here within the Finnish context.
Well, that's one of the big topics for FEANTSA. We are often being told we speak too much about Finland. So I can tell you a bit about it, but the key for Finland is a political determination. It's that the government decided, I think 15 years ago, that they wanted to eradicate homelessness, and the policy line stayed the same even when government changed, and the funding stayed the same. So it's quite impressive, but it's determination. Yeah, I mean, FEANTSA has a lot of resources on the Finnish model and the housing first approach. So there is definitely a lot to look at, but I think the key is political determination, witnessed through funding, and a housing first approach.
And I think vacancy is probably very much part of the, particularly in the context of the environmental pressures that we see addressing, sort of using good stock and vacancy, dereliction, using our city centres, our brownfield sites, which there's a reluctance to do because it can be more expensive. But for a society and indeed for governments and local authorities, it's actually cheaper because you have infrastructure around them. So there's huge environmental benefits to reusing and rebuilding and making use of that stock, I think, in a huge way. So that can contribute to addressing homelessness, but there's no silver bullet, as we know, particularly in Ireland, as we know, when it comes to homelessness. It is sustained action around driving the homeless numbers down. But in the Irish context in particular, the number of initiatives that you outlined, which are about drawing the stock of vacancy into the public housing system, I think is really informative. And if we could match that with making sure that they are a significant percentage of those are allocated to people who are at risk of or experiencing homelessness, that would help us absolutely to drive down homelessness. But it's not a given that would happen, even if we were to start addressing homelessness. So I think the point you make about making sure that you have an ongoing significant commitment to addressing homelessness, matched to ambition around vacancy would help us to drive it down. But both things have to be part of the solution. And I suppose that speaks to the point I was making at the opening, is that we take as FEANTSA does, we take the initiatives around vacancy as a highlighting how we can better use housing stock, but then we have to match it put it through the lens of FEANTSA or the Simon communities about how it's useful in addressing homelessness. So that's very much what today is about, and why we're engaging in these properties. So a very useful question. Thank you very much to the questioner. So other interesting points, I think we've captured on. You talk a little bit about the European context, and obviously there isn't a housing competency, but I think it's been really striking how post-COVID and the sort of an awakening or recognition, or maybe a speeding up of the recognition of the importance of housing as social infrastructure. Particularly in the context of COVID and post-COVID, where people who didn't have a home, or having a home as a place to keep yourself secure and safe in the context of a pandemic, how important that became. And I think the New European Bauhaus movement and the epoch seem to be, if not driven by COVID, but certainly enhanced and created a political softening of the ground, which allowed them to progress. And I'm just wondering how important you think that was.
The COVID, you mean?
Well, sort of the positioning of, so the advent of, not COVID itself, obviously that was wasn't a good thing, but it was that one of the silver linings. Did it create a political momentum around it, particularly obviously in Ireland? The number of people experiencing homelessness were well protected by the system, but that wasn't true universally throughout Europe, and there was some countries where there were very significant deaths in the early stages of COVID, in particular, when we didn't fully understand it. So I'm just wondering, was that part of the momentum? Is that why we're seeing the European momentum as well? And is that helping to, is that European context helping to enhance some of these initiatives? Yes,
so definitely, I think it is increasing the legitimacy of political action in this field. It wasn't the trigger at all, because both the Bauhaus, the new European Bauhaus, and the epoch were in the pipelines before. It's years before that it's prepared and that there is advocacy being done for those initiatives to be adopted than in 2021, 2022. But I think COVID increased the legitimacy, but also the social angle of this initiative. For instance, the new European Bauhaus at first was very much about an architectural perspective and more of a design and beauty perspective. And I think since it's been launched, it is being socialized somehow. And the importance of the inclusive angle of this new movement is being increased. And for the epoch, I mean, the European platform on combating homelessness, it is a tool. It is a tool to then now it's on the table, and it is left to see how it will be used by European member states, by the European Commission. But it is a great step that it is here now. We hope it can really empower member states in mutual learning, in data collection, and can create a momentum to address homelessness.
Okay. Thank you. Some optimism. It's always a good. So I'll take it. The last question here was, would a tax on property, not the owner, be useful? This is where the owner is unknown or hiding, legal term in REM, permits the tax to be attached to the property and levied when it's sold or rolled up for a period when the local authority can just take it over. Lots of owners emigrated or died interstate in Ireland. That's as an example of what happened in the Ireland. There's also a need for a cheaper, faster mechanism than the compulsory purchase order, which is a very long-term solution in the Irish context. Indeed, a number of local authorities local authorities that I've spoken to and people who work in this area would see sort of having to resort to compulsory purchase order as being very much the last step and a last resort, that really should be about, as you said, about engagement and sort of moving the system forward and creating a culture of reduced vacancy. But I just, for you, just are there any examples or in what you were looking at where the tax was, those kind of initiatives were actually levied on the property rather than the individual? And also where there was compulsory purchase orders in the Irish context, as I say, it's a very slow process. And you talked about the example where they've contacted a number of the large agencies to say, if you're not going to use them, we're going to take them. So is the compulsory purchase order a more flexible tool in other European countries, or is it also a long-term tool, but it's just used, essentially the threat of it is used to move things forward? What's your experience on
that? Let me go back to your first question was, sorry, I forgot.
Property tax.
Yes, property tax. Honestly, I don't know. I don't know, but I'll be very happy to look into it and ask the cities I've been in touch with. And on the per case order, I got the feeling that in Barcelona it was quite flexible, but also it's a moving reality. As I said, they're trying to change it, advocating to the regional authority so that it would be even more flexible. So I think there are very different models, and some of them give more flexibility than what I hear from your Irish context. Yes.
Okay. So, Clotilde, we're just a couple of minutes from the end. So if anyone has any last questions, I'll put them to you. But if we don't, I'm going to say thank you very much for your time and for your very interesting presentation. I'm going to say thank you to our participants for taking the time, for engaging so fruitfully with the questions. It's not always the case, so it's nice to get lots of questions. It makes my job much easier. And also to say, just for those who have come along today, that there will be another Simon talk next month, and we'll be circulating the email in due course with information on that. And do come along, do come and join us. So with that, I just say thank you very much to Clotilde, and thank you to everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Monday, and indeed the rest of your week.
Thank you very much, Wayne. I hope it was useful. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.